Rick is a little pathetic kid reading about Yamato, the adventurer who failed to obtain Akashic records, a treasure that can grant any wish, because he couldn't defeat Kaiser Alcipiat, the legendary monster. The adventurer wished that someday, children dreaming of becoming adventurers would take down the dragon and make their wish come true. He told his dad he wanted to be like Yamato when he got older, but his mom was worried because adventuring was dangerous. She worried that Rick would only end up hurt, so she advised him to pursue a different career path. His dad backed her up and told Rick to stop believing in fairy tales. One day, Rick was appraised, and the appraiser told him he had an inborn skill, though they didn't know the specific skill yet. Rick was hyped because he had an inborn skill like Yamato, which strengthened his resolve to become stronger. The appraiser advised him to wait for the skill to manifest naturally because it can't be triggered through training. Rick ran up the hill overlooking his village, grinning from ear to ear. He was sure his parents would support him after his inborn skill manifested, and he was excited that he would become an adventurer. He punches the air, solemnly pledging to achieve his dreams of becoming an adventurer. Rick told his friends about his inborn skill, and every day he went to school they always questioned him about it, asking if it had manifested yet. Rick told them to be patient, but they began to doubt him because his skill was yet to manifest after a year. Rick figured out that his inborn skills wouldn't manifest during his childhood. Regardless, he tried to get it to manifest, to no avail. As Rick grew into a teenager, his friends consoled him because his skill didn't manifest despite having a marker. They tried to encourage him to become an adventurer regardless because there were other successful rich without skills. Rick wasn't interested because his goal wasn't to become a rich adventurer. After some time, Rick secured a job as a receptionist at the local guild. He informed his parents about his newly gained employment, and they were happy that he had found a harmless and stable job. Rick took the receptionist job, but wasn't satisfied with sitting behind a desk. He was always envious of the adventurers who came in daily to complete different quests. Rick still tried training to bring out his inborn skill, but all he produced was sweat on his brows. Rick wasn't happy with the life he was living, but he got out of bed determined anyway. A few years later, Luna was employed as his junior, and one of his friends married and had a son. His parents got older with streaks of gray hair appearing on their heads, but Rick was grateful to have them with him. Rick secretly kept going back to read the adventures of Yamato and relive his past fantasies about becoming an adventurer. One day at the guild, Alika was having trouble with an adventurer's quest, so Rick stepped in to help. The adventurer thanked him with respect as an old man, which amazed Rick because he was only 30. Alika apologized for being a burden to him, but he encouraged her to take her time to familiarize herself with the workings of the guild. Rick informed her of the possibility of a new quest because monster sightings in the village had risen because they were being cleared out from their lairs. He informed her that the quest would likely be a D-rank quest because the monsters that had been sighted were low-level monsters. Alika decided to prepare for the quest when Zaid the adventurer suddenly walked into the guild. He approached Rick and showed him his medal, and Rick was surprised that he was already promoted to B rank. Zaid was happy that he could now make a living solely from adventuring. Rick hesitantly congratulates him. After closing hours, Rick was tipsy as he walked through the streets, heading home. He was disappointed in himself because, unlike him, who had been sitting in one place doing the same thing for the past 14 years, his friends were putting in the work and moving up in life. Though Rick wasn't complaining about his stable everyday life, he knew he would have been a high-rank adventurer if he had taken his friend's advice years ago. He stopped thinking about that because it was pointless when he suddenly heard people screaming because monsters were attacking the city. Rick rushed to the scene, recalling that monster appearances had increased significantly. A giant troll rounded the corner, surprising Rick, who wasn't expecting a mid-level monster because there had been only reports of low-level monsters. Rionette crossed the road with some groceries, which attracted the monster's attention, and the orc started approaching her. Rick jumped in to shield her from the orc, but she told him to stand back. She took down the orc with a single flick. Rionette escorted Rick as he walked home, and he thanked her for saving his life. They exchanged names, and Rick asked her for her rank, thinking she was either a B or an A-rank adventurer. Rionette told him she was an S-rank hero, which surprised him so much that his eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He recalled that the HQ directly manages all S-rank adventurers because they are the cream of the crop. Rick used that opportunity to tell Rionette about his dream of becoming an adventurer and defeating Kaiser Alcipiat. He told her his inborn skill was yet to manifest and asked for her advice on his decision to become an adventurer at such an old age. Rionette noted how courageous he was to try to step in to save her, and she praised him for it because it's a vital trait of an adventurer. However, she told him his mana reserve was too low and he couldn't try to build it up anymore. She advised him to give up on his dream because there was no way he would become an adventurer at such an old age. Though Rick was hurt by her advice, he put up a happy face and tried to take it. He thanked her for giving him a reality check and freeing him from the burden of his dreams which had plagued him for years. She apologized for hurting his feelings, but Rick told her he would take their meeting as compensation. He asked her out as a joke, but to his surprise, she accepted, agreeing to meet him the next day. The next day, Rick had a belly full of butterflies as he anticipated meeting with Rionette. Alika noticed he was in such good spirits as he encouraged her to give her best at her duty post. Zaid came into the guild for his first B-rank quest, but to his surprise, Rick already had it ready for him. Zaid was also surprised that Rick was in high spirits. After work hours, Rick was skipping happily to the meeting point, hoping they go on a date with Rionette if things went well. People suddenly started panicking because monsters had appeared which crushed Rick's spirit, who wondered why fate was against him. Rick ran to the scene of the monster's appearance. Rionette suddenly paused and fell to her knees because she was overwhelmed by the magic energy of a dragon. Rick rushed to her side to help her up, and a monster took advantage of this opportunity to strike, but Zaid came to their rescue. He teased Rick for picking such a place for a date when it was swarming with monsters. Other adventurers, who formed an emergency party with Zaid, backed him up, and he advised Rick to retreat to safety with Rionette. The emergency party members combined their skills to take down more monsters. Rick was jealous of how cool they looked while fighting and kicked himself for giving up on his dreams. Rionette told him they weren't safe, but Rick assured her they were in good hands because Zaid would protect them from the monsters. Rionette told him they were not powerful enough to take down a dragon which was close by. She informed him of her traumatic condition, which made her lose her magic control whenever she sensed dragon magic. Rick was skeptical because a dragon had never appeared in the city before, but he became a believer when a huge shadow engulfed him. Everyone was surprised to see a dragon approach a human town, and Rick figured out that the dragon was the curse of the increased monster appearance because they were trying to escape it. The dragon landed in their midst, and while Zaid started retreating, recalling the guild's rule about encountering a dragon, the other adventurer lost his nerve and attacked the dragon. They were brought to their knees by the dragon, who let out a roar because it was pissed. Everyone tried to escape the dragon after realizing they couldn't take it down, but the dragon put up a barrier, trapping them inside. Zaid attempted to break the barrier, but it wouldn't budge, so he decided to say his last prayer. Rick suddenly stepped up to face the dragon, to the surprise of Zaid, who advised him against it because he was just a receptionist. Rick told Zaid he stepped up to face the dragon because he wanted to end as an adventurer. Though Rick knew he didn't stand a chance against the dragon, he couldn't help but feel excited because he always wanted to live life on the edge as an adventurer. His blood was boiling as he reached for a stone which he hurled at the dragon with all his might. Zaid took inspiration from him, encouraging the other adventurers to step up so they don't get outdone by a receptionist. They all charged the dragon together, trying their different skills and hoping to take it down. The dragon was enraged by their attack, and they noticed it was about to use its fire breath, so Zaid put up an iron wall, but it wasn't enough to block the dragon's attack. They were all hurt by the dragon's breath, and they wondered if that's where they would take their last breath. Zaid lost all motivation while Rionette was disappointed that she couldn't fight the dragon. Rick suddenly got up and approached the dragon, hoping to make his dream come true. The dragon squashed him like a bug, but he suddenly acquired his inborn skill and got out from under the dragon easily. Everyone was surprised by his sudden shift in power that they couldn't believing what they were witnessing. There was so much magic overflowing from Rick that it was visible, which surprised Rionette. Rick recognized the power as his inborn skill and wondered why it took so long before it activated. Rick decided to use the lizard as a training dummy for his newly acquired skill. The dragon shot flames using its advanced dragon breath at Rick, but Rick was unaffected by it. Rick released his awakened brute valor skill, which took down the dragon and its barrier, to the surprise of everyone. Rick was satisfied with his performance against his dragon, but suddenly collapsed from exhaustion. He woke up sometime later with his whole body hurting. Rionette advised him to stay still so he wouldn't strain his body further. She informed him that every magic circuit in his body was destroyed. She also told him he had been asleep for a week, and he wondered why she had been waiting on him for so long. She told him she was waiting to invite him to her party, called the Orichalcum Fist because they shared the same objective of taking down Kaiser Alcipiat. Rick was surprised to learn that the legendary monster was more than a fairy tale story. Riant was sure Rick would get stronger if he trained with them because he took down the dragon by sheer courage alone. She assured Rick that he could still become an adventurer, which relieved Rick because it was the first time someone had ever said that to him. He was so relieved that he was moved to tears because he couldn't believe he still had the chance to become an adventurer despite taking the long way around. Rick then disappeared for 2 years to be trained under the strongest team of adventurers to learn all the basic skills to become an F-rank adventurer. Rick gets thrown to the ground after a grueling training session. He's so exhausted that he thinks he won't live to see the next second. But his masters are impressed by how much he has improved over the past 2 years. They are convinced the E-rank test will be a piece of cake, but they hope they hold back so he doesn't end up destroying the arena, but Rick remarks that his strength is nothing compared to theirs. Upon returning to the city, Rick enters the Adventurers Guild to take the E-rank promotion test. Rick decides to walk over to the counter and present his guild ID. The receptionist is about to present him with his admission ticket when she recognizes him as her mentor. Rick remembers Alyssa, even though he hasn't seen her in 2 years. He's surprised that she's now working in the Central, but she tells him she was more surprised when he suddenly quit the guild back 2 years ago. She's even more bewildered that he's now an adventurer. Rick is uncertain because he knows it isn't smart to start as an adventurer by age 30. People usually start at the F rank during their teens and then get promoted to the E rank 2 years later. Alyssa wonders what Rick has been up to in the past 2 years, and he tells her that he was up in the mountains, training with some senior adventurers. A drunk adventurer suddenly walks up to the counter and rudely makes a pass at Alyssa. Alyssa tries to decline his request because it's still within her working hours, but the adventurer tries to force himself on her. Rick tries to get the adventurer to back off, but the adventurer is pissed that Rick is ruining his non-existent Riz game. Rick pulls him back and gives him a belly tap while Alyssa apologizes for the inconvenience caused. Rick doesn't mind because he had several cases like that working as a guild clerk in the past. The adventurer suddenly passes out in Rick's arms, which draws the attention of the other adventurers in the guild. Rick sets the adventurer on the floor and explains that he has too much to drink. He advises everyone to take that as a life lesson and always drink responsibly. Alyssa hands Rick his entrance ticket while wishing him luck in the test. Rick sees that he's contestant 4242 and he suddenly becomes worried because he has an unlucky number. Rick walks out of the guild where Rionette is waiting for him. Meanwhile, the other adventurers notice a handprint on the drunk adventurer's armor, and they're surprised by this. They recognize the drunk adventurer as Damold, a former rank adventurer who's wanted for assault. Alyssa thinks back, and she can't believe Rick's hand was imprinted on Damold's armor despite handling him so gently. Rick proceeds to a part of the guild where his details are recorded. His height is measured, but one of the clerks is surprised to see that Rick is 32 years old. After his physical stats have been taken, Rick proceeds to a room with a crystal ball where the participants' magic energy is measured. While most of the participants are ranked between D+ and C-, Rick barely generates any reaction. Rick is ranked as F-, which makes the other participants mock him for being old and useless. The participants note that he has the world record for the lowest magic ability, and they hope they don't turn out like him. The guild official is about to call up the next participant to the crystal ball, but to his immense surprise, the ball suddenly cracks from overload. Rick then walks into a hall where the participants are instructed to strike a slime bag with all of their strength so that their power can be measured. This brings back memories of Rick training with one of his masters who trained him using a golden slime bag. Back then, Rick was sure he wouldn't be able to destroy the bag because he wasn't strong enough. His master insisted that he must destroy the bag because it was a fundamental adventurer test. His master proceeds to destroy the bag easily, noting that he can destroy 200 slime bags at once. This motivated Rick to start training with the bag, racking up 50,000 punches per day. The participants are called up to take the punch test, and their abilities are noted by an observing official. One participant is called up, and some other participants recognize him as the second son of the Duke. Though he was only 11 years old, he was said to have the magic equivalent of a C-rank adventurer. The son of the Duke is so hyped to show off what he's made of to the other participants. He conjures a level 3 natural blaze magic to the surprise of everyone, but when he releases it, Rick notes that it's tiny. The other participants are impressed with the little impact the ball of flame has on the slime bag. The observer is also impressed by the abilities of the child prodigy. But Rick can't help but feel underwhelmed because that's not how he remembers the level 3 Natural Blaze magic spell. He recalls when his master also cast the same spell in the past, but it resulted in a huge fireball that burnt down a nearby forest. Rick concludes that the prince compressed his magic because they're indoors, and he silently praises him for being so talented. Other participants take their turn at the slime bag, and Rick notes that the green slime bag also has a high damage capacity. The moderator calls his number and walks up to the slime bag. The observer stops him, noting that he became an adventurer when he was already 30 years old. The observer is skeptical about Rick's abilities because he didn't train his magic when he was younger. He advises Rick to give up on his dreams because it is too late for him. Rick remembers his grueling training session with the golden slime bag. He punched the bag so much that his fists were bloody, but he was exhausted even though yet to complete his daily quota. His master motivated him to get back to his feet, and Rick did so because he didn't want to give up. Though Rick agreed with the observer, he wondered why older people weren't allowed to become adventurers irrespective of their age. Rick channels this rage as he strikes the slime bag, bursting it open and spilling slime everywhere. The other participants were so shocked they wondered who Rick was, but Rick thinks that the bag was defective. The Duke's son is pissed that Rick surpassed him, but he believes he will perform better in the defensive ability test. The participants move over the defense session, and Rick defends against a level 4 nature-composed magic, which proved to be too difficult for the others. The guild official commends his defensive abilities, impressed that Rick was able to use a level 1 nature-composed magic to counter his spell. The official decides to use a level 5 nature-composed magic spell, and he recommends that Rick use a higher spell level for defense. Rick shamefully admits that he can only use the level 1 nature-composed magic. The official is surprised by this because Rick's magic control is so precise, but Rick tells him not to worry, assuring him that he'll be alright. The official thinks that Rick is underestimating his abilities, and he decides not to hold back. He chants the incantation for his nature-composed magic spell and casts the level 5 winds spell at Rick. Rick easily defends against it, clearing out the magic spell without breaking a sweat. Sylvester, a first-class knight, notices this from a distance and wonders what is happening. He decides to visit the test area, and he arrives to meet some guild officials on the ground. They brief him on what happened, and the knight wonders if they're playing a prank on him. The female official shows him Rick's details, and he's surprised that Rick is 32. He also notes that he worked as a guild receptionist for 14 years and wonders if the clerk title was given to someone who defeated the dragon. But the official tells him it's not. Meanwhile, Rick joins the other participants to take a written test, and after the test, he sits on a bench outside with Rionette. She asks him how the test went, and he tells her he would get a perfect call because he put his 14-year experience as an office clerk to good use. Rick is concerned because he got an F- on his magical ability test, but Rionette reassures him that he would be alright. The Duke's son suddenly approaches Rick, addressing him as a commoner, but Rick has a problem remembering his name, which pisses him off. Freed suddenly starts crying, pointing out that Rick stood out more than him, preventing his official debut into the adventurer life. Rick is surprised that Greed is crying, but his senior sister and eldest child of the Duke, Angelica, suddenly steps in to teach Rick a lesson for making Freed cry. Angelica throws her glove at Rick, challenging him to a duel, but Rick picks up the glove, pointing out that nobles don't value clean clothes because they don't do their laundry. Rionette points out that he has accepted the duel by picking up the glove, and Rick can't believe it when it dawns on him. They proceed to the arena where Angelica asks that they each state their condition for the duel according to the rules of the Kingdom of Philheim. Angelica proposes that the loser will act as the victor's servant for life. Rick is worried because Angelica is a member of the Knights of the Realm, the protectors of the peace in the kingdom. Rionette points out that Angelica is equivalent to a B-rank adventurer, which worries Rick even more. But Rionette tells him to go easy on her. Rick doesn't fancy his chances because he's just an F-rank adventurer, but Rionette reminds him of his training in the past 2 years. Rick almost loses his mind remembering how bad his training was, but Rionette tells him to have more confidence because the Orichalcum Fist, the strongest party in the continent, considers him as their member. Rick is inspired, and he immediately regains his confidence. Angelica decides to go easy on him since he's just an F-rank adventurer as she draws her sword. Rick notices that she's a sword user who boosts her abilities with magic. She rushes at Rick, intentionally missing him to show off how fast she is. Rick appears stunned and Freed tells him Angelica is so fast that she is nicknamed after the Flash. Rick doesn't seem impressed by this name, but Angelica promises to stop holding back in her next attack. She uses her speed ability again to try to attack Rick, but in his eyes, she's so slow that she appears to be running on water. He wonders what earned her nickname since she's so slow. He's lost in thought, but Rionette calls out to him, and he dodges Angelica's attack with ease. Angelica is surprised that Rick dodged her attack, but thinks it was luck and decides to attack him again. Rick is disappointed by how slow she is, but impressed by how strong he has become. Angelica suddenly trips on a stone, turning her lunge into a spinning attack that Rick is barely able to dodge. Rick couldn't read Angelica's movement and he's on edge, but Angelica decides to act like her attack was on purpose even though she tripped. She tells Rick she will be attacking him with 3 times more speed than before, and she uses her ability, but she's still very slow from Rick's perspective. This time, Rick takes no chances and dodges her attack, to the surprise of Angelica. She can only use her advanced ability 2 more times, but she decides to go with it because she has no choice. She attacks Rick again, but he dodges it easily. She unleashes her last attack, but she trips, turning it into a low attack. Rick was ready to counter her attack, but her low attack took him by surprise. He quickly punches downwards, hoping to catch Angelica in time. This creates a huge hole, and Angelica is thankful that she tripped because she would have been on her way to the afterlife now. Angelica asks him who he is, and he tells her he's an ordinary man who became an adventurer after working as a clerk. But Angelica doesn't believe him. Rock decides to go all out in the battle, but Angelica surrenders, to his surprise. She decides to leave the arena, but Rick reminds her about the condition for the duel, telling her he would be using her condition since he didn't state his. Angelica summons her last energy and she puts them into her legs, getting out of the arena before Rick can say another word. Rick doesn't consider the duel a win because it doesn't feel right, but Rionette tells him Angelica already acknowledged her loss. Rionette suggests that they return to the guild because the results will soon be released. She also informs Rick that his masters will be visiting him to see how he is doing. The weight of this news is so overwhelming to Rick that he immediately has a meltdown. The Akashic Record, a treasure which grants any wish, is given to anyone who defeats Kaiser, the ultimate monster. An adventurer was unable to defeat the monster when he had an encounter with it, but he hoped that someday one of the upcoming adventurers would be able to bring down the beast and make up for his failure. Meanwhile, Alika announces to the adventurer that their test will be released momentarily. She tells them that mana will be sent to their exam tickets, and the tickets of those who passed would glow blue. She further informs them that the successful candidates will participate in a mock battle in the second stage the next day. Rick isn't in good spirits because he's not confident that he will pass, but Rionette consoles him, reassuring him that he would ace the test. She informs him that he would have to triple his training if he somehow fails the test, which makes Rick pray to all the existing deities to pass the test. His ticket suddenly lightens up, and he stares at it anxiously, wondering if he'll pass. His ticket glows blue after a while, and he rejoices, informing Rionette that he passed. She congratulates him on his success, and they leave the classroom as Rick expresses his relief because he doesn't have to return to training. A foul stench suddenly fills the air and Rick can't help but cover his nose, wondering where the stench is from. A noble suddenly approaches Rionette and introduces himself as Raster, the first son of the Duke of Diamuit who rules over the north. Rick is having a hard time remembering his name, so he decides to call him Northy. Raster asks Rionette's name and she introduces herself to him. While the Raster is marveled by how sweet Rionette's name sounds, he frowns at Rick when he introduces himself because he has no business with someone like him. Rick is heartbroken by this, but Raster doesn't care about that as he turns his attention back to Rionette. He tries using his not-so-superior line to pick up Rionette, but he can't even pique her interest in the slightest. Raster continues regardless, asking Rionette to become his second wife. Rick is fed up with his advances, and he decides to come in between them, which pisses off Raster, wondering why an old man was being so nosy. Rick informs Raster that he can't keep hitting on Rionette because she's his girlfriend. Raster is surprised to learn this, but notices Rick's participation ticket, which cracks him up. He can't believe Rick was still an F-rank hero in his old age. Rick assumes that Raster is also there for the exam and tries to pull an Uno reverse card on him, but Raster is disappointed with his assessment capabilities, telling him that he already made it to E rank when he was 14. He informs Rick that he's just there to be an examiner for the second part of the exam because he's a rank adventurer. Raster shows Rick his crest, and he asks Rionette to leave Rick because he's worse than a commoner and join him for dinner. Rionette kindly turns down his request, telling him that she's dating Rick, who's so red on his face that he almost explodes. She teases Raster, saying that his perfume has a disturbing smell which isn't very pleasant. Rick now knows where the origin of the smell is, but Raster is pissed off by their insults, and he promises to show Rick the difference in their capabilities if he ends up being his examiner. He walks away fuming, hoping to have a chance to prove to Rionette that she made the wrong decision. Rick didn't like that he was already starting on the wrong foot with his potential examiner. He hoped that Raster wouldn't turn out to be his examiner during the exam. Raster went for dinner at the castle, but was still fuming from his encounter with Rick. He promised himself that he would prove to Rick that he was superior to him. Fried and Angelica suddenly come running to him with tears running down their faces, and he's surprised by this, wondering what is making them sad. Fried tells him that he was disgraced by an old man during the test, while Angelica tells him that the same man almost disgraced her by explaining her dual oath. Raster is pissed that some old man had committed such an unforgivable sin, but then he suddenly figures out that the man could be Rick. He asks Fried for the old man's participant number, and Fried tells him it was an unlucky number, confirming his suspicions. Raster is pleased that he will have the chance to disgrace Rick during the second part of the exam, and also get his revenge for what he did to his siblings. The next day, Rick and Rionette are walking to the location of the second test when Rionette reminds Rick to hold back. Rick tells her he can't hold back, especially if Raster turns out to be his examiner. Rick is filled with dread at this possibility, but Lynx suddenly stops him on the way and informs him that he would be in charge of his test in the second stage. Rick is rejoicing because Raster isn't his examiner, but Lynx expresses how unusual it is for a 30-year-old receptionist to switch jobs and become an adventurer. Rick thinks Lynx is making fun of him, but Lynx expresses how impressed he is by his determination. Lynx is glad that a fellow middle-aged man like him can inspire others to chase their dreams regardless of their age. Lynx felt a sense of déjà vu because he became an adventurer at 24 years old, so he knew that Rick had a goal in mind. Lynx informs Rick that he's yet to achieve his dream of getting to a rank despite being in his 40s, because it took him 20 years to get to B rank. Rick was impressed by Lynx's passion at his age and eager to get into the mock battle with him. Lynx warns Rick that he won't hold back, but he gives him a handshake and invites him for a drink after the test. Around the corner, Raster is silently eavesdropping on their conversation with a naughty smile. Lynx felt how much Rick trained just by shaking his hand, so he decided to train even harder. As he returns to his quarters, Raster corners him so they can discuss. In the prep room, Rick is very cheerful and Rionette notices this, but a messenger suddenly comes into the room, bearing news for participants numbered 4200 and above. He tells them Lynx has fallen ill and their new examiner will be Raster Diamuit. Rick doesn't recognize the name till Rionette informs him that it's the Northy from the previous day. She tells him Raster may be related to Angelica and Fried since they all bear the same surname, and Rick can't believe his ears. The other participants express concern because they're scared of Raster. Rionette wonders what the big deal about him is, and one participant tells her that Raster is nicknamed the F-Rank Crusher because he torments participants that grab his attention. Rick realized that he was in a bad situation because he gained not just Raster's attention but also his wrath. Raster enters a mock battle with one of the participants, and he easily defeats him with his nature-composed ice magic. He expresses his disappointment in how powerless commoners are, but an elite guard suddenly calls his attention to give him a message. Meanwhile, Rick was having a meltdown wondering what he would do to get out of his predicament, but Rionette tells him there's no point worrying. Rick tells her that he wants to go home, but he remembers that his training would triple if he does that, so he decides to make peace with the fact that he won't achieve his dreams. Rionette advises him to gain inspiration from others who tried to tell him he couldn't achieve his dreams instead of allowing their words to weigh him down. She assures him he will pass the test and defeat the perfume noble because she believes in him. She informs him that she always believed in him from the first day he decided to become an adventurer. Rick is so moved by her words that he regains his confidence. A hooded figure suddenly comes up to Rock and offers to help him through his midlife crisis through fortune-telling. The figure tells him he doesn't have to be suspicious, and he offers to give him a free trial first. Rick feels reassured by this, and he takes a seat with the figure. Rionette notices a spell on the seat, but she can't act quickly enough as Rick disappears as soon as he sits. Fried praises himself for being an Oscar-worthy actor because he got Rick to fall into his trap, but Rionette suddenly threatens him and asks him to spill the location where Rick was teleported to. Fried tries to be tough and withhold the information, but Rionette demonstrates her powers and Fried spills the beans like a broken tap head. He tells her that Rick isn't too far from their location because he can only manage to use teleportation magic within 100 meters of his location. Rick wonders where he is, wondering if he's behind the arena when suddenly surrounded by mercenaries hired by the elite guards. Rock thinks they have him mistaken, but they introduce themselves as the elite guards if Diamuit and Rick realize that Raster is behind his predicament. The guards promise to make sure he is in no condition to take the test, but Rick is disappointed that they have to resort to such dirty tricks. The chief guard informs him that they are all equivalent to B rank and A rank adventurers, and Rick realizes that he won't be able to get away unscathed. His masters suddenly come into view, wondering why Rick was outside the arena instead of taking his test. Rick tells Brufston that the guards are helping him train as an excuse, but the guards debunk his claims, threatening to take down his masters if they don't leave immediately. Rick begs the chief guard to call his men off, but he tells them to take down the masters instead. One of the guards tries to use his sword on Brufston, but his sword shatters as soon as it makes contact. Brufston expresses how impressed he is that the guard has trained his body, but he expresses disappointment at his negligence of weapon strengthening. The guard gets pissed off and tries to throw hands, but his fist is crushed like a cereal flake. Brufston heals his hand and advises him on improvements in his fighting form. The guards are surprised that an orc can talk and use magic. The chief guard suddenly recognizes them as the members of the strongest party. Mizet figures out that Rick is being bullied and decides to handle things peacefully with his newest invention, a custom gun with magic crystals and lead bullets. The other guards decide to go for the other masters since Brufston seems so powerful, but Mizet takes them down with his weapon. He asks Rick if he wants a shot with his weapon, but Rick turns down his request. The chief guard was now sure of his theory that they were members of the strongest party. Another guard threatens to take down Elisarette if anyone moves a muscle, but they advise him to let her go for his good. Elisarette wonders what the guard is doing, and Rick tells her he wants to play with her. Elisarette is open to playing with the guard, but he hurts her instead and she gets triggered. She unleashes a high-grade nature magic that sends the guard flying, to the horror of others. The chief now recognizes Elisarette, the vampire mage, who is the youngest and strongest magic user. Mizet, the half-elf half-dwarf, is the best weapons craftsman. A Shork, the orc with great intelligence and superhuman strength. The chief guard tells the other guards that they're all S-rank adventurers who are members of the Orichalcum Fist, the strongest party in the continent consisting of only S-rank adventurers. The chief guard is so entranced by their presence that he decides to retire and live in peace. Rick decides to return to his test while his master handles things. Meanwhile, Fried wonders how long Rionette would keep holding him hostage, and she tells him she would keep it up till Rick returns. Fried tells her Rick won't return because he's walking into an ambush by his family's elite guard. He's surprised when Rick comes back unscathed, and he wonders how he made it out without a scratch. Rick apologizes to him as Rionette tosses him away like a worthless rag doll. Lynx suddenly walks into the room looking hurt, and Rick helps him to a bed. Lynx informs Rick that Raster was the one who hurt him and made up the story that he fell ill. Lynx was disappointed that he couldn't stand a chance against Raster, but Rick wondered why Raster would go to such lengths just to be his examiner. Lynx recounts how Raster beat him up after he told him about his dream to build a school which kids who want to become adventurers can attend. Raster told him his dream was worthless because he could only manage to build up a third-rate school since he's a third-rate adventurer. Lynx is disappointed that he couldn't say something back to Raster and advises Rick to forfeit the exam so he doesn't experience a worse fate. Rick reassures Lynx, saying he will be fine as he steps out of the room towards the arena. Raster easily takes down another participant when one of his guards returns, apologizing for failing his mission. Raster is surprised that Rick still came out for the test because he thought he would be discouraged by everything he said against him. Raster decides to give Rick a taste of true suffering, but Rick is unfazed by his threats, silently promising to take him down for what he did to Lynx. Raster takes down the weak adventurers who enter the arena so easily that they could be mistaken for practice dummies. Adolf is a spectator with the ability to visualize an adventurer's strength by looking at their fundamental abilities comprising physical strength, body control, magic reserve, and magic control. He looks at Raster's ability scores and his eyes almost pop out, making him realize the candidates have no hope of beating Raster because he outclasses them in all aspects. He sees Rick coming up to be Raster's opponent and wonders what an old man would do against Raster. He uses his ability to visualize Rick's stats and immediately gets permanent eye damage because Rick is so overpowered that his stats surpass his measurement scale. Alyssa meets up with Rionette, who she recalls accompanying Rick the day he registered at the guild. They exchange greetings and Rionette asks her to join the other members of the Orichalcum Fist to spectate Rick's match with Raster. Alyssa follows Rionette to meet the other members of the Orichalcum Fist, where she is informed that Rick is their member. Alyssa is surprised to see an orc among them, but maintains her composure and introduces herself to the group. Mizet offers her a seat beside him, but Rionette leads her away so she doesn't get harassed. Rick steps into the arena, and the party members wait in anticipation, wondering how well he will do against Raster. Rionette is sure that Rick will pass the exam without a single hair in his body being harmed, but Alyssa expresses her concern because she doesn't think Rick would be able to handle Raster's abilities. Brufston wonders why she had such little faith in Rick's abilities. She explains that Raster usually cleans the floor with anyone he examines because he outclasses them as a rank adventurer. Brufston reassures her, telling her she has nothing to worry about because Rick will hold his own against Raster. Rick steps into the arena and Angelica's voice cuts through the air, hyping her big brother up to beat a few years out of life of the old man who disgraced her. Freed also steps into the audience stand covered in bandages and begs his big brother to help him get revenge on Rick. Rick stands unfazed as Raster expresses surprise to see him breathing despite sending the elite guards after him. Raster promises to make up for the incompetence of the peasant who failed to take him down. He warns Rick not to look down on him because he's on a different power level, unlike mere commoners. Rick could see that Raster is quite powerful, but he doesn't let that deter him. He asks Raster why he chose to become an adventurer, which surprises him because he wasn't there for a queue and a session. Regardless, he answers, telling Rick that he became an adventurer because he has the talent for it. He explains that the adventurer title will increase his status as a noble, earning him more reverence from other nobles. He informs Rick that he's planning to quit soon and retain his status as an adventurer, while his record is still good because he has grown bored with the profession. Rick is convinced that Raster became an adventurer for all the wrong reasons, and he vows not to lose to him. Raster advises him to speak to his elders respectfully because he won't speak anymore when he's done with him. He starts the battle with a level 1 nature composed ice magic shot, but Rick doesn't move a muscle as the shot misses. Raster is surprised that Rick is so petrified with fear, but Rick is just recalling his conversation with Rionette before the match. She advised him to calm his feelings at the beginning of the match and observe his opponent. Rick decides to take Rionette's advice and observe Raster, but Raster seizes the opportunity to attack how he pleases. Raster releases a level 3 flame nature composed magic, but Rick remains stationary, continuing to observe. He's hit by the fire blast, which makes Alyssa worried that he's hurt, but Brufston reassures her that the flames only tickled him slightly. He asks her about the 4 fundamental abilities that make up an adventurer's strength, and she lists them out. He points out that a person's magic reserve must be developed before age 20, after which it can't be increased. Alyssa figures out Rick's magic reserve is so low because he became an adventurer by 30. Brufston tells her that's why they trained him in the other areas, where he could improve to make up for his abnormally little magic reserve. Raster promises to bring Rick to his knees with his next attack, and he releases a level 4 nature composed wind spell at him. Rick is unfazed by Raster's spell because it only feels like a cool evening breeze. Brufston informs Alyssa that he helped Rick build his physical strength from scratch, while Mizet taught him magic control. Alysseret was his sparring partner, while Rionette trained him in body control. Alyssa is surprised that Rionette is Rick's teacher because she thought she was just an ordinary maid. Brufston recounts how Rick held onto all the training they gave him to the point that he almost qualifies as an S-rank adventurer. Raster is getting frustrated because his spells do not affect Rick, but he keeps chipping away at him. He releases another level 4 nature composed magic spell at Rick. Alyssa is surprised that Rick is an S-rank adventurer, but Rionette tells her he has no idea of his true capabilities because Brufston pushed his expectations past the norm. Raster suddenly releases a barrage of spells because he has reached his tolerance limit for Rick's impunity. He promises to take down Rick and his peasant friends since they failed to face reality, as he casts his spells. He crushes Rick with a huge rock, and he's convinced that Rick is defeated, so he apologizes for getting worked up. Rick suddenly breaks through the rocks, surprising Raster and his siblings who also thought he was defeated. Rick's resilience pisses Raster off, so he decides to end him with a huge magic punch. Rick counters his punch easily, which surprises Raster because he didn't expect Rick to counter his super punch. Meanwhile, Rick now understands why Rionette told him only to observe when the battle begins. He figures out that Raster only has a vast magic reserve, but low stats in everything else because he forfeits training. Raster warns him about getting overconfident because he countered his punch. Raster says the incantation for a level 3 nature composed flame magic and releases it at Rick. Rick stops the spell easily, and he snuffs it out easily because it wasn't properly put together. Mizet explains that Rick snuffed out Raster's magic because of his precise magic control, which allows him to conserve his mana. Raster can't believe Rick is so lucky, but he charges at him again, wanting to take him down with a magic punch. This time, Rick is prepared and responds with a punch of his own. Raster hurriedly casts a protection spell, which activates just in time to protect him from taking damage. Angelica is surprised that Rick made Raster use defensive magic, but Raster couldn't make Rick do so. She confirms her suspicions that Rick isn't an ordinary adventurer. Raster admits that Rick's abilities surpass that of an E-rank adventurer. He also claims that he's exhausted because he has examined a lot of candidates before Rick. He's pissed that Rick is so lucky, so much so that his magic is not affecting him. Rick sees through his excuses because he knows Raster is cooking them up, so he doesn't acknowledge his abilities. Rick informs Raster that he withstood his magic because he has better magic control. Raster wonders how Rick got so strong after 2 years despite having a minute magic reserve. Rick recounts the grueling training and harsh conditions he was under to build up the other 3 stats he could still improve. Alyssa wonders how Rick survived such training conditions, and Brufston tells her that he used his healing magic to bring him back to life each time he gave up the ghost. He tells her Rick was able to become so strong by repeatedly breaking down his body and rebuilding a new one. Mizet was impressed that Rick continued his training despite being pushed past his limits many times by all his trainers. Raster doesn't believe Rick was under such training conditions because he can't fathom that such conditions exist. He also doesn't think Rick could be motivated enough to train so hard for so long. Rick tells him his dream was his motivation, and though Raster doesn't sound convinced, he asks Rick what his dream is. Rick tells him his dream is to defeat Kaiser Alcipiat, the world's strongest monster. Fried laughs at his dream, summing him up as an idiot. Raster can't believe Rick said those words with all seriousness because he thinks the monster only exists in bedtime stories. Alyssa recognizes the monster's name as the monster in the Tales of Yamato, the legendary hero. Brufston tells her that the ultimate goal of the Orichalcum Fist is to bring down the monster. Raster tells Rick he has the dream of a small child whose brain isn't mature enough to handle reality. Rick is content that Raster doesn't believe him because he knows he won't be able to help them defeat the monster anyway. Raster is fed up with Rick's ramblings, so he aims to bring their fight to an end. He uses a level 7 nature composed magic to immobilize him with vines. Rick is impressed that Raster can use a level 7 magic with awe, saying an incantation, and Raster takes in his praise, promising to show him what true talent looks like. Raster chants the incantation for a level 8 nature composed earth magic, which surprises Rick because he wasn't expecting it. Raster finishes his incantation for his ultimate spell and casts it, which covers him with tree vines, creating a tree golem he controls. Rick calmly prepares an air shot spell, and Raster wonders what he plans to do with such basic magic. Rick tells him he will punch straight through his ultimate technique, but Raster laughs off his threat as a desperate delusion. Rick asks Raster how many times he has used his ultimate spell, and Raster tells him he has only used it a handful of times because he mastered the spell after a few tries. Rick tells him he has used his air shot spell more than 100 million times, and Raster is fed up with his lies. Alyssa also thinks it's impossible to use one spell so many times, but Brufston tells her Rick did it with the help of space-time magic. Raster prepares to smash Rick and his ridiculous dreams to pieces just like he did Link's. Rick frees himself from his bonds as Raster strikes out with a level 8 nature composed impact magic from his golem. Rick uses a level 1 nature composed air shot magic to counter the punch that destroys his magic golem and sends him flying into the audience stands. Raster can believe a noble was brought down by a commoner who can only manage a level 1 nature composed magic spell. His siblings are also surprised that their brother, who was born with such a rare magic talent, was taken down by an old man who has no business being an adventurer. Rick stands victorious in the arena after defeating Raster, proud that his dream is still undefeated despite Raster's threats. The audience is shocked that Rick took down Raster despite a clear difference in their magic abilities, but Alyssa is impressed by how strong Rick has become. Rick walks out of the arena and runs into his party members, who commend him for putting up a good fight. They congratulate him on his victory and his pending promotion, and Rick thanks them, noting that he has become much stronger. He wonders how he missed how strong he has become, and he humbly thanks his masters for taking their time to train him well. They tell Rick he doesn't have to be so formal because he's making things weird. Raster walks out of the arena with his siblings, who are urging him to see a doctor for his injuries, but he tells them he's fine. Rick calls out to him, and he decides to tell him how he defeated him because he knows the question is bugging him. Raster thinks he wants to take some jabs at him, and Freed tries to get in a word for his brother against the old man, but Angelica stops him. Rick explains that he limited his number of techniques and then trained exhaustively on them so he could master them perfectly. He advises Raster to refine his techniques until he can cast them at full power while sleeping. He tells Raster to take it as some life advice from an old man, but Raster walks past him. He suddenly stops and warns Rick to be prepared because he will be his examiner in his next exam. He threatens to bring an end to Rick and his impossible dream when they meet again, and he walks away. His siblings run after him, but Angelica suddenly stops and bows in reverence to Rick, acknowledging his powers, which surprises him. She then rushes over to her brother's side and offers him support as they walk home. Later that day, Rick waits in the locker room with the other candidates as the announcer announces the successful candidates for the exam. Meanwhile, Alyssa is with the other party members in a diner and wonders if it's okay for them to start celebrating before the results have been announced. Brufston reassures her that their celebration won't go to waste. Rionette approaches Rick, who keeps listening as the successful candidates continue to be announced, noting how calm his demeanor is, unlike how nervous he was when he passed the prelims. Rick tells her he was remembering his earlier years, after recalling the path he took to get here. Rick was grateful for this chance as he listened to the announcer announce his number as a successful candidate. Rick is given his badge and he leaves the arena admiring it. Rionette congratulates him for finally becoming an official adventurer, and he tells her he couldn't have done it without the help of the Orichalcum Fist members. Rick takes a moment to thank himself for not giving up on his dreams despite the opinion of naysayers. He proudly raises his fist, declaring he's now a full-fledged adventurer. Lynx walks through the forest wondering how much further he has to go up the mountain before arriving at Rick's place. He recalls how he congratulated Rick after his successful completion of the promotion exams. He reminded Rick of the drink he promised him before the exam and offered to come over to Rick's place for it so he could meet his party. Rick's face gave his emotions away, and Lynx couldn't understand why he made such a face. He kept moving through the forest, up the mountain, as he remembered that Rick warned him to wear his best gear if he was intent on coming to see him. He wonders why Rick gave him such a stern warning as he keeps following the directions. He arrives at a castle on the mountain and wonders if he was given the wrong directions to a demon lord's castle. Lynx walks up to the castle gates where he stands in awe of its grandeur. Though scared for his life, he summons the courage to ring the castle bells. He calls out to Rick, and the huge gates suddenly give way to Rick's familiar face. Rick welcomes him to the castle, and Lynx gladly walks into the courtyard, admiring the scenery before him. Rick apologizes for bringing him to a distant location just to have a drink. Lynx points out his observation of the area being free of monsters, and Rick tells him monsters don't approach the castle. Lynx asks him why he warned him to wear his best armor, and Rick sternly tells him the armor is to ensure his body stays intact, which scares Lynx. Rionette welcomes Lynx as he enters the main castle with Rick. Lynx thanks her for the courtesy and expresses his appreciation for her contribution to saving his life. Alycerette calls out to Rick from the stair top, and Lynx is surprised by how lively she looks. He hopes his daughter grows up to become as lively as the little girl in the castle. She suddenly unleashes a level 6 nature level magic by saying trivial words, which surprises Lynx. Lynx can barely react to the spell in time to move out of harm's way, but Rick comes to his rescue, deflecting the magic spell away. Lynx is surprised that he's still alive as Rick scolds Alycerette for using magic within the castle, which he warned her against. Alycerette blames Rick for it because he didn't play with her earlier when she requested. Rionette asks to deduct the fees for repairs from her meal, but Elisarette suddenly becomes remorseful and apologizes to Rionette so she doesn't reduce her meal. Rick informs Lynx that he wants to accompany Elisarette so she doesn't keep using magic within the castle walls. Rionette leads Lynx to his room and tells him to make himself comfortable as she leaves the room. Lynx stares out the window, thinking he can't tour the full castle because it's too big. He suddenly notices Mizette sitting outside, toying with his creations. He walks out to meet him and Mizette recognizes him as Rick's visitor. They exchange introductions and Lynx asks Mizette about his steel productions. Mizette shows off his custom weapon, explaining that crafting weapons is his hobby. Lynx decides to try out the model and Mizette hands it to him, giving him instructions on how to use it. Lynx couches to maintain his balance and he pulls the trigger, targeting a training dummy. The launcher fires, the force sending Lynx to the ground as the target is destroyed. Mizette makes a note to reduce the recoil when he remodels it. Meanwhile, Lynx realizes that Mizette's weapons can change the tide of war if mass-produced for the capital's army. He returns to the castle, wondering why such weird occupants inhabit it. He spots Brufston reading in the castle library, and he's surprised to see an orc in the castle. Without raising his head, Brufston permits him to enter the room, and Lynx apologizes for his intrusion. He enters the library, surprised by how many books are in it. Brufston tells him the room is his bedroom, not a library, explaining that he surrounds himself with books because they relax him. Lynx realizes Brufston is an intellectual and wonders if he's also part of Rick's party. He asks Brufston if he has read all the books in the room and Brufston tells him he has read most. He explains that he is having difficulty catching up on recent books because he has been focused on training Rick. Lynx is surprised the orc is heading Rick's training and he asks Brufston to instruct him just as he did Rick. Broigston obliges his request after noticing Lynx's eyes are glowing with passion, just like Rick's. Meanwhile, Rick is searching for Lynx and Mizette informs him that he went with Brodston for training in the woods. Rick wonders why he would subject himself to such a cruel fate. Lynx is undergoing such a strenuous training session that he says his last prayers, hoping his wife and kids remain well in his absence. He is saved by Riant, who is taking a huge hog back to the castle as their dinner. Lynx thanks her for saving his life and Rionette recognizes that he has been training with Brufston because he had some weight attached to his legs. He recounts how Brufston pushed him off the cliff after telling him to run down the slope with the weights attached. Lynx knows he wouldn't have survived if Rionette wasn't there and Rionette confirms his statement, informing him that Brufston was the cause of Rick's trauma. Brufston suddenly appears, cutting their conversation short and drags off, Lynx to continue his training. After the training session, Lynx is glad to be alive, but Rick is pissed at him for throwing caution to the wind. Lynx explains that he only took Brufston's offer because he promised to go easy on him, but Rick tells him never to believe such lies. Mizette expresses his displeasure with Rick for exaggerating things and Brufston backs him up because he could easily revive Lynx if he gets hurt. Rick is surprised by how little a human life means to them. Elisarette is eager to play with Lynx, but Rick tells her off because she would turn him to dust. Mizette points fingers at Rick for inviting Lynx to the cast despite knowing the outcome of his visit, and Rick kicks himself for that. They return to the castle and Rionette pours some tea for Lynx and Rick, telling them to be patient while she makes dinner. She walks out of the room and Lynx expresses how incredible Rionette is. Rick agrees with him and Lynx wonders how far their relationship is. Rick tells him they aren't in a relationship because he's too old, but Lynx tells him they can be compatible because he's 20 years older than his wife, which surprises Rick. He convinces Rick by explaining that things will work out if they have feelings for each other. They gather at the dinner table having dinner and Lynx commends Rionette's meal. She appreciates his compliments and Rick tells Lynx to eat as much as he can manage. The others request seconds and extra drinks, so Rionette leaves the dinner table to bring more. Lynx tells Rick it is a good time to show his affection by giving Rionette a hand and immediately jumps out of his seat, running after her. Lynx asks the others about Rick's inherent skill and Brufston explains that Rick cannot control his skill because it is a special skill that can only be activated under special conditions. Mizette points out that Rick would be overpowered if he could control his skill. Brufston informs Lynx that Rick is on an S-rank level without weapons or skills, but points out that he would surpass them if he could control his Reckless Soul skill. Lynx is surprised that Rick could become so powerful. Brufston questions Lynx about the 6 Grand Orb magic crystals because he works at the capital. Lynx recognizes the name as the orbs mentioned in the Legend of Yamato. Brufston explains that the orbs are key to opening the door connected to the spiral region where Kaiser Alcipiade inhabits, and they needed to defeat him. Mizette informs Lynx that the orbs should be emitting strong mana because they are in the season of their activation, which occurs every 200 years. Rick asks Lynx if he has heard rumors of such a thing, but Lynx thought the legend was all fairy tale previously. He now realizes it's a true story because Rick's party want to take down Kaiser Alcipiade. He tells Rick he hasn't heard anything about the orbs, but promises to check with the secret intelligence that handles non-public quests. Rick secretly asks Lynx for more relationship advice after he couldn't assist Rionette because she handled everything perfectly. Ray, a new adventurer, is cleaning up the guild with a long face because she wants to be out on the field instead of being restricted to guild chores. She practices her skills with the broom to take down invincible foes when a conversation from the reception draws her attention. She heads out to see Rick, Elisarette, and Brufston standing before the guild master. They request a special quest, but the guild master doesn't grant it to them, so they try to convince him they can handle it. Though the guild master is convinced of their skills, he tells them their party doesn't meet the requirements of having 2 rank adventurers in a 4-man party. Rick suggests they hire a temporary member, and the guild master immediately offers up Ray because she always wanted to go on a dangerous mission. Though Ray always wanted to go on a dangerous mission, she wasn't enthusiastic about teaming up with a talking orc. The guild master calls her to order, telling her to be respectful to the party because they are high-level adventurers. All Ray sees is a party consisting of a talking orc, an old man, and a pampered child, but team up with them regardless. They head out for the quest, and Elisarette informs the party that she is detecting something ahead. Ray asks Rick what they are searching for, and he tells her they are searching for some orbs around that area. She wonders if the orbs are worth anything, and Rick tells her they are too dangerous to be left alone because they attract monsters. She tries to convince Rick that she can solo any monster despite being only an F-rank adventurer, as she aims to become an A-rank adventurer. Her dream inspires Rick, who decides to work hard to increase his rank. Ray asks about his current rank, and he tells her he was recently promoted to E-rank. She writes him off as a late bloomer that she would outrank soon. Elisarette points out to a light source ahead, and they head towards the source. Meanwhile, Rionette is worried about Rick and Elisarette. Mizette assures her they will be fine because Broigston accompanied them. He decides to test out a gadget which produces wind without mana on Rionette's clothes, but she destroys the machine after catching him red-handed. They arrive at the location of the light source where they see a wyvern having a meal. Ray is so freaked out that she hides behind the group because she knows the monster is dangerous. Brufston approaches the monster, and she wonders if he has a plan to defeat it, but Brufston casually punches it out of the way, telling her he plans to beat up the monster. Ray pleads with him to find a new plan because he could attract more other wyverns from the nest if he hurts the current one. He tells her he didn't take down the first wyvern because he wants more to attack. Ray complains about the party because they love dangerous situations unnecessarily. Brufston is at his wit's end because she's so loud, so he tells Rick to take care of her. Rick leads her away as she keeps complaining that Rick put her in great danger. Rick teases her about her strength, but she tells him she was talking about her future. A defeated wyvern suddenly lands beside them to the surprise of Ray because she can't believe the others sent the monsters flying from their location. Rick quickly moves her out of the way as a red wyvern lands ahead of them. Ray is scared because the monster is so strong it would give rank adventurers a run for their money. Ray advises Rick to run, but Rick tells her to run while he tries something out on the dragon. She suddenly garners courage and tells Rick she will also stand and fight. Rick tries to dissuade her, but she tells him she won't leave him behind because they are party members, albeit temporarily. She offers to support Rick, but he takes down the dragon with a single blow. Rick is now confident of his strength, but Ray is so surprised she doesn't understand why Rick advised her to run to safety. They return to the guild the next day, and the guild master commends her for doing a good job the previous day. He notices that she is blanked out, and he wonders why. She apologizes to him because she experienced a lot the previous day, which draws his sympathy. He knows the members of the Orichalcum Fist always leave an impression. She recalls when she parted ways with Rick and his companions. They were taking home a wyvern corpse, and she wondered what they would do with it. They told her it was for dinner, and she was surprised because she didn't know wyvern were edible. The guild master explains that the party members are special because they are all S-rank adventurers. Ray is eager to become an S-rank adventurer, so she hands the broom to the guild master and bolts out the door. Meanwhile, Brufston presents the red flower, one of the 6 grand orbs, to the other party members. He informs them they can locate the other orbs if they resonate the red flower with mana. Mizet tests out his theory using his world mapping magic, which reveals the orb is in Heractopia, a country famous for its love for combat sports and home to the Colosseum. Watch this next video. See you on the next one.